Hello, everybody, and good evening. My name is Don Arleth, and you're watching World Talks here on TVP World. Kyrylo Budanov, a special envoy for Vladimir Putin, is in the United States for talks extending the U.S. sanctions waiver on Russian oil and U.S.-Russia economic cooperation. Meanwhile, Putin has announced a short Orthodox Easter ceasefire from the afternoon of April 11th till the end of the next day, which Kyiv has now confirmed. Now, joining me to discuss these and other developments in Ukraine is William B. Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Mr. Ambassador, great to see you, and thank you for joining us on World Talks.
Thank you, Don. Good to be here.
Yes, now Ukraine has proposed this Easter ceasefire for about 2 weeks now. It's been pretty much rejected and ignored by Vladimir Putin, but I guess he finally came to terms. Why do you think Moscow is doing this ceasefire? You think it's purely out of goodwill, or maybe something that they want in the United States?
There's no goodwill coming out of Moscow, Don. No, they clearly want something. As you say, President Zelensky has proposed this, and I will say that he's proposed ceasefires for years now, 2 years. Together with the Americans. And every time the Russians, Putin says no. So he said yes this time for 1 day. President Zelensky had proposed a longer ceasefire. Putin says 1 day. And as you say, they're after some benefit from the Americans.
Presumably, Kyrylo Budanov is in the United States, trying to get the United States to extend this sanctions waiver on Russian oil. Do you think that's in the cards right now? We've seen oil prices come down quite a bit since this ceasefire was announced, but still the Strait of Hormuz is closed. So what are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that it didn't make sense to waive the sanctions on Russian oil in the first place. And it certainly does not make any sense to continue those sanction waivers. To allow them to sell oil defeats everything that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Ukrainians have been doing to deprive the Russians from the revenues, from the money, from the resources that they use to pursue the war. So no, I don't think it makes any sense to extend the waiver. I think it should not have been waived in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Ukrainians have been provided the best sanctions, and those are attacks on the oil infrastructure in Russia. That's done quite a bit of damage. Now, Budanov has said that peace is possible, but not just in a matter of days. Do you believe that a deal could be in the making potentially this year? And what will Ukraine have to do to get Washington to stop pressuring Ukraine to give up the remaining territories in the Donbass?
Well, you're right, Don. Mr. Budanov is optimistic. I'm not sure where his optimism comes from. He knows more about what's going on in those negotiations, certainly, than I do. However, there's no indication that the Russians are willing to make any compromises, that the Russians are even interested in a ceasefire or an agreement. No indication whatsoever. So you ask what it's going to take? It's going to take pressure on Putin. It's going to take pressure that we just talked about, economic pressure, reducing his ability to sell oil on the world market, continuing those sanctions, increasing those sanctions. As you say, the Ukrainians are doing their bit on sanctions, on keeping the Russians from getting those revenues from the sale of oil by attacking the ports, the Russian ports, where these are being where this oil is being exported. So that's the pressure that needs to come on Putin, and if that comes, then yes, I think that it's possible to come to some kind of an agreement this year because the Russians are not in good shape. The Ukrainians are regaining some momentum on the battlefield. The economic pressure on Putin is having some effect. So, yeah, I think it is possible, but it's going to take more pressure on Putin.
And weapons deliveries for Kyiv is questionable after the war in the Middle East. U.S. stocks are low, and especially on Patriots. Ukraine just received a fresh batch, a few Patriots, but it's only stopgap. What happens if the United States decides that it can no longer sell Ukraine weapons, and especially in the case of Patriots?
The Ukrainians are thinking through the answer to that question. Ukrainians have to do recognize that the Americans are not going to be there forever. And there's cause to worry for about exactly the kinds of things that you're saying. That is, if the Americans decide they're not going to sell these weapons to the Ukrainians, then the Ukrainians are going to have to figure out what to do. And the Europeans have been very helpful in that, more helpful than the Americans on this. So the Europeans have stepped up, will continue to step up. There are other ways the Ukrainians have found ways to defend themselves against certainly the drones and the cruise missiles. The ballistic missiles are difficult to defend against, but they're even working on that. There are other ways to do that. So the Ukrainians have been incredibly innovative and resourceful for more than 4 years now, Don, and they will continue to be that way.
Yes, and Ukraine's made these new partnerships in the Middle East. This was, of course, to counter cheap drones. They have tons of experience in doing this, and they've done so cost effective as compared. I mean, there are reports right now in the Middle East that Patriot missiles, $1 to $3 million a piece, are being fired at $30,000 Shahed drones. The United States is reportedly, the United States administration is not happy that Ukraine went and made these bilateral security agreements in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia and others. Why exactly do you think that is? And why is the United States not learning from the experience in Ukraine and harnessing this cheap technology to give the American taxpayer more bang for their buck?
Don, you're absolutely right. And it turns out that the U.S. military is trying to learn from the Ukrainians. The U.S. military has been in touch with and is working with the Ukrainians on exactly the things that you say. That is, the Ukrainians know how to deal with these drones. They've been dealing with these drones for more than 4 years, and they've learned how to defeat these Russian drones, which, as we know, started off in Iran. These are Iranian drones to the Russians. The Russians now send them back to Iran. And so the Ukrainians are using that technology, that experience, that network to defeat these Russian and Iranian drones. And they are getting the benefits from these Middle East countries. Middle East countries are providing contracts, funds, and even some weapons, even the possibility of some, as you say, these very rare Patriots that make no sense against drones, but make a lot of sense against these missiles. So, yeah, we should be learning from. The Europeans are learning from. The Mideast allies are learning from the Ukrainians. That's because they've got the experience.
Yes, and now the NATO, I'd like to ask you about NATO and its role in this whole operation in the Middle East. Of course, Donald Trump expressing fury and having some very select words for Europeans that didn't want to join in opening the Hormuz Strait. I know that Secretary General has announced that some NATO nations will participate in such an operation. But, really, how should the European NATO allies right now leverage the whole situation which is going on in the Middle East to their advantage to get some help on Russia from the United States? Can it be done?
It can be done, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians are working on that. They're doing two things. The Europeans and the Ukrainians are doing two things at the same time. Number one, working with the Americans, trying to work with the Americans when they can, try to make the case to the Trump administration that is in U.S. interest, security interest, to, first of all, have allies. And the Trump administration is learning that allies are actually, turns out, very important, very useful in Iran, for example, in the Strait of Hormuz. So they're working, Europeans, Ukrainians, working with the Americans on these kind of cooperative efforts within NATO, coalition of the willing in the Strait. But at the same time, they are working to develop their own capabilities. I say again, the Ukrainians and the Europeans are putting a lot of effort, a lot of funds into developing their own capabilities, military capabilities, defense capabilities, drone capabilities, defense industrial capabilities. These are going to be very important over time for the Europeans to build up their support and their capability against the Russians, which are the real threat.
And my final question here, Mr. Ambassador, the upcoming elections in Hungary are crucial for Ukraine since Orban is blocking funds from the EU. He's blocking accession. He's also blocking sanctions on Russia. How do you feel as a former ambassador that J.D. Vance went to actively campaign for Viktor Orban? Do you see any parallel like this in history? Is this something we're going to see more of in the future? What are your thoughts on this issue?
My thoughts are that this will boomerang. This will have a backlash against any foreign power, any foreign government trying to intervene in elections. Whether it's the U.S. trying to intervene in the Hungarian elections, the Russians trying to intervene in American elections or Moldovan elections or Romanian elections. I mean, we've seen this, and we see what happens. People don't like it. Americans didn't like it when the Russians were interfering, and they clearly did. They clearly tried to. And my bet is that the Hungarians will not like it, that the Americans are trying to intervene, or the Russians are trying to intervene in the Hungarian one at the same time. So my expectation is that the voters will demonstrate that this is a bad idea, it's a bad tactic, and should not be done.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much. Very much appreciate your words. William B. Taylor, the former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Don.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thank you for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.